proud to welcome who actually didn't do a good job. And she didn't do a good job in listening, something very unwomanlike, isn't it? So while she didn't do a good job in listening when she was told that actually in the company that she was working, women just wouldn't be put on the leadership team. But now she is a leader, and here she is the Area Vice President, Northern Europe of Citrix, and President of the trade group Tech UK, Jacqueline de Rochas. There you are. And interviewing Jacqueline will be, of course, the CNN International Business' Nina dos Santos. And Nina, as most of you know, has her own famous TV show, but maybe what not all of you know is that she could do that TV show in German, in Spanish, in Italian, possibly other undiscovered languages yet, but luckily for us, she's going to interview Jacqueline in English today, so please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Savannah. Ladies and a few gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and after that very interesting debate that Jacqueline was hosting, we're now going to be having a bit more of a private moment, a bit more of a private insight into the president of not just Tech UK, but also the vice president of Citrix, Northern Europe, Ireland, Scandinavia. Jacqueline de Rochas, as you probably know already, is a veteran of the tech scene here in Europe, but she, like many of you in the room, holds many job titles. She's a mum of 3, she's got 5 dogs, she's recently taken up motorcycling and is an avid yoga practitioner, so like many of us, she knows a thing or two about work-life balance. And just speaking to Jacqueline before we stepped on stage, like many of us, she also has those stories of how she started up in her career, probably being told, oh, leadership roles for women, oh, we're not quite ready for that, but she found her own way to the top. And she hasn't just worked in Citrix, she's worked in companies like McAfee, many big blue chip firms as well. So let's start out with this conversation, and I will open it up to the floor, but I want to point out, if you want to interject at any point, you can find me on Twitter, you can just tweet me directly with questions, and I'll incorporate them as well. Jacqueline, thank you very much for joining us. So let's start out with that famous moment when you started your career, and you wanted to get to the top, like any ambitious person. Did you find that at some point you were knocking on the door and it was shut?
Yes, I think technology being a male-dominated industry, I found a couple of very important moments which I would consider to be forks in the road of my own decision-making. So the first one you heard in the introduction, where I went for a role as the country manager for the company I was working for, and I was running a $300 million business with 400 people, and I was up against a young Irish guy who ran a $10 million business and about 5 people. And I thought, okay, I've got a reasonably good chance here of getting this job. However, I was told at that point that they simply didn't put women on the leadership team. And this was in 1999. Now, that fork in the road was quite interesting because I reframed that and thought, well, I guess the miracle is at least they said it to me and I didn't bang my head against the glass ceiling for a number more years. And so I went on to find the job of my dreams, and I really enjoyed that. But for me, it was a good learn and something that happened quite a lot in the tech industry for me in those days.
I think, especially in the technology world, where you look at the numbers of women who work and leave the field when they have children, how do you think the technology industry can get away from this image of being male-dominated? Because, at least in the media, that's the way how it's perceived.
It is male-dominated. I think the only way we're going to stop it being male-dominated is to put some more diversity into teams. And let's face it, diverse teams are more productive. You know, if you have one woman on the board of your business, it is 20% less likely to go bankrupt. And the stats increase as you have more diversity on the board.
But is it the board that's important here? We have so many different studies that seem to suggest different things. On the one hand, we hear that you need a critical mass of at least 3 women on the board for them to feel confident enough to speak up and be heard. But then you also hear, well, there's no point in having women on the boards if we don't have women coming up through the ranks. So what's important?
Well, I believe that fish rots from the head down. And what I mean by that is that, you know, it is a leadership issue. And if we have women at the top, then we have the opportunity to do something about it and create that succession planning and the talent coming through. And, you know, actually, I think it's an obligation. So I would definitely say that we have to take it on as a leadership challenge and then empower the people below to be leaders in their own right, and then they take it on as a leadership challenge, and so on and so forth. So as an example, you know, I do a lot of work in schools, and we put on awards for 11-year-olds and above, but once they've won an award, it's their obligation to then inspire the year below so that they become the role models. And then, you know, again, fish rots from the head down in a good way as well. So, you know, that can ripple downwards too.
A lot of women, especially in the tech sector, but in other sectors as well, find themselves at the point where they train up, they've done their education, they've perhaps been taken onto the graduate trainee scheme, they're coming up through the ranks, and then they have a kid. And then they panic. Many of the people who are here will know that this time last year I was heavily pregnant, and I've become a mother since. And you really notice that when you have a child, everything changes. So what do you think can be done to encourage those women not to fall off the career ladder? So is it culture?
I think, well, I think culture trumps strategy every time. And we do need to make sure that we have support systems in place which keep our women in touch with what's going on in technology, because it moves at such a pace that confidence wanes extremely quickly. And so keeping them engaged and just doing those outreach touch points from time to time is really, really important in maintaining the confidence of our women and grabbing them back in. It's interesting because I've got a back to work program at Tech UK, and this is about retraining women after a maternity or career break. Sometimes they've been out of the industry for as long as 15 years, and we do a retrain program. And the blocker that I was not expecting was that I simply can't find the women. They disappear, and we don't seem to have this alumni effect or network effect to grab them back into the industry. It's hard to find women to get them back in.
But you've managed to stay in the industry. Talk to me about that journey, right from day one to today.
I think necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? So I stayed in the tech industry. So I have 3 children. And having had my first child, I then found myself in a position where I was not with my husband, so I became a single mum in the tech industry on top of everything else. And I needed to work, frankly, so I had to just simply work harder. I'm not going to pretend I did anything magic here. I simply worked harder. And, you know, I'm not sure there's a magic bullet to that, but the good news is that in the technology industry, I did earn enough to be able to afford some childcare. It wasn't sophisticated childcare, but it was enough to keep me going. And now I think times have changed where technology enables us to work hard anywhere. So we have got the ability to be wherever we are, and we can use that to our advantage.
I was about to say, because the big irony here that you'll have noticed over your time here, because you've been in this industry for 28 years now, is that on the one hand, yes, the technology sector has a reputation for being perhaps male-dominated, viewed that way, but it is technology that is helping women in the workspace to have more flexible lives. And you've often talked in the past about how the rollout of broadband across, for instance, the UK can help women in their careers because they can work more from home. Do you really think we're going to see a time when culturally that'll be acceptable? It'll be acceptable to leave the office and work from home more often?
I absolutely believe it's happening already. I mean, by 2020, I think 50% of the workforce will have that option. And you know, what's interesting is that we have the technology to work in a cafe or work on a train or work walking along a street and to be really efficient. And I think it's not just mums, actually. I think it's working dads. I think it's people on the disabled spectrum. Inclusion starts to become really important. And broadband, which you mentioned, has to be rolled out everywhere. I heard a story about a vicar who strapped a broadband mast to his spire in an English village a couple of months ago because there wasn't enough broadband for his community, which I think is hysterical. Very inventive, but actually it is important that our governments roll out the right infrastructure to enable inclusion and to make sure we've got the right skills and enough talent in the workforce.
So, going back to your journey here, you're now at the helm of, obviously, Northern Europe as Vice President for Citrix, but also Tech UK, so you have the opportunity to, I suppose, influence policy as well, make a change here. What do you think the biggest difference you could make here to women's working lives could be?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference, there's a couple of things. One is to ensure we've got access to women returners. Since we've bothered to train and we've invested in amazing women in technology, I would like to make sure that we can grab them back into the technology industry and retrain them for, at speed, because I think that's important. I think the second piece is to put pressure on governments to have affordable childcare in places where we don't have that. And I do think that having broadband and inclusive, flexible working practices across the industry is very important as well.
Has anybody ever taken you up in the boardroom on how your leadership style is slightly different from maybe male colleagues? Have you ever felt singled out? And sort of how do you overcome that? Because I suppose everybody in this room will have their own stories of adversity.
Yeah, I mean, in the boardroom is different from a leadership role, and I've got 3 board positions. And I have to say that I had one example, which I'll share with you. And our chairman of the board was worried about the pay scale of our chief executive. So in some market climates, chief executives are paid rather a lot of money. They're contractually allowed to have this money, but it just doesn't sit well with the shareholders. So he banged the table and said, I'm going to demand that the CEO takes a 10% pay cut. And I said, well, might I just try a different tack? And he said, well, you can, but it won't work. I said, okay. So we invited the chief executive in, and I said, we've got a climate where shareholders are unhappy with the amount of money chief executives are being paid, yours included. You are contractually allowed to have this payment, but I was wondering if you were thinking about doing the right thing. And the chief executive said, do you know, I have been thinking that myself, and I've decided to take a 50% pay cut. And you know what? The lesson for me was actually there's diversity in the boardroom right there. And you don't have to be an AlphaZilla and break the door down and leave dead bodies around you to get stuff done. You just don't have to be that person. You can be positively deviant in a really diverse and interesting way.
It's a great story. Did you get recognition, though, I'm interested, from the board for your role in that? Because sometimes women don't feel that they get the recognition they need for the results they deliver sometimes.
I'm a big one on self-acknowledgement here, and I stopped myself doing that. I didn't do that, but I wanted to. And I didn't even make eye contact with the chairman at the time. I just elegantly let it go by. And that, for me, it was enough. And you know, the gift was the life lesson that actually, you know, I was able to make a massive difference in one question.
So the message for you is be confident enough to know that you managed to achieve that particular result, even if sometimes, let's face it, we don't get as much feedback as we sometimes would need.
No, we don't get much feedback. But I think, you know, I find that if I am, my characteristics are to try and do things in an elegant way. So elegantly execute is something that I like to think I'd stick to quite a lot. And I'm not someone who does want to leave dead bodies around me. So I do try and find a way of asking a smart question versus making an aggressive statement. And I think that's a really good thing for women who are not naturally aggressive and confrontational and don't need to be. That smart questioning is sometimes devastatingly effective.
So, speaking of questions then, why did you choose technology?
Well, I actually wanted to be a newscaster on the BBC, so I probably wanted more your job than my job. Actually, before that, I really wanted to be an air hostess. That's before I started traveling and realizing that might not be my journey. And I didn't become a newscaster on the BBC because I came home from my business and language degree, not a tech degree, which I'd done in Germany. So we could have done the interview in German, actually. And I fell into technology because I needed to earn money, and I became a recruitment consultant for the technology industry for 2 years, and then decided that selling a product that talked and had an opinion was probably quite tricky. So I went to work for my biggest client, and I've been in technology ever since. So I rather think it chose me than I chose it.
Just going back to the issue of moments of sort of adversity, moments of, we've all had that kind of moment where, let's face it, sometimes casual sexism enters the room. And I've often used in this conference, this time last year I mentioned, and for those who are in the room today who weren't there last year, an example of a friend of mine who's on the board of a company who was asked to make the coffees by the CEO of the company she was buying when she walked into the room. So I said, "What did you do?" She said, "Well, I made the coffee." And then I sat down, made his coffee, made one for me, the rest of the board, because he'd ordered for the rest of the board, so I had them coffees made, and then I offered him half of the amount for his company that, I was going to. And the question I'm asking here is, as a woman, when you are facing that kind of situation, do you make it work for yourself? How do you hold yourself back from your natural emotions and make it work for you? Because you've got an example of a client who you had a similar relationship with once, who's still he respects you the most, and he's one of your biggest clients.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think revenge is a dish best served cold. So, I always have that in the back of my mind. But I had a situation where I was taking some clients to the Grand Prix in the UK, to Silverstone, and I was flying them in by helicopter, because that was a very special thing. And one of my team said to the client, "Would you like to meet the managing director?" And the client said, "Oh, yes, no, that would be very nice, thank you." And they introduced me, and he said, "Oh, my God, you're a woman." And I said, excuse the language, I said, "Oh my God, I didn't realize I needed a penis to make a decision. But let's discuss it over lunch." And, to this day, we have been big friends, very open. He has spent rather a lot of money with me on software over the years, for which I'm rather grateful. I'm sure it's guilt money, and I'm good with that. But as I said, revenge is a dish best served cold. And that's how great relationships are sometimes formed in adversity. But again, I think it's I like to think that I observe a situation before I react. I'm not a big one for, going at it full tilt because I'm emotionally unhinged. I think I might have been when I was younger, a bit more of an alphazilla when I was younger, but lesson learned.
Let's start taking some questions from the audience there. Oh, you see, there's a few hands that have already shot up. Can we have a question from the lady at the back? There's a microphone coming. Thanks.
Is it working? Oh, thank you.
It is.
My name is Vibeke Thompson. I'm from Gender Hopes. It's a Monaco-based organization, and we work to increase gender equality. You were touching on maternity leave and how women drop out of the workforce. I think you're missing the role of dads here, because if you only focus on women, they end up doing the double shift. So I have 3 little kids, and every time they need to call me from school because one of them's sick, it's always me they call. They absolutely forget that I have a husband and a father too, who could easily pick them up from school as well. I think also in terms of paternal leave, here in Monaco, it's 15 days. And most fathers don't even take it. because there is a bias about it, and they think, oh, if he takes paternity leave, he's not really committed to his job.
Yeah.
So the mother ends up being the main caretaker for the child. And so my question is basically, what can we do there? Do we need better legislation here? Do we need increased paternity and parental leave, like in the Scandinavian countries? Would that bring a true change of mentality? And finally, I believe that there will be no equality in the workplace as long as there's not equality at home. So.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And I believe that work is not a place; it's where you are. And I think that's true for both mum and dad. And I certainly look after the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries for Citrix, and it is so much the other way. I mean, it's a real role model for parental engagement. And, I love the fact that I do have rather a lot of men in my teams in the Nordic countries as well, but equal amounts of women up there. And both are very, very engaged in childcare. So I think it is a great role model, but they've set it up in a way that works both culturally. Nobody bats an eyelid if you leave at 2:30 to go and pick up the kids, and that's right. When I arrived at Citrix, I had one of my team. She said, the great thing about working at Citrix is that I can now work part-time. And I looked at her productivity and I thought, you're not working part-time, you're working full-time, because when you've done the kid thing, you're logging on and doing everything else because that's who you are. You just work at these perfection-type rates and standards that are so high. So I put her on full-time pay, even though in her mind, she thought she was doing a part-time role. So I think again, we need leadership, we need role models, and we need both parents engaged in that responsibility. And mums have to let go as well. So I think it's a mutual journey of opportunity.
And does it make it, just following on from that question, Jacqueline, does it make it easier if you're running a business, and Citrix is an American company, so a business that's from even outside of Europe, if you were to have the rules and regulations that are there that you can abide by, that makes a level playing field for everybody, say, in the Scandinavian countries? Is it easier?
Do you know what? I'm not a big one for rules and regulations. I'm a big one for culture, because culture does trump strategy every time. It doesn't matter how many rules you put in place. I think culture can suffocate great things. And I believe we need to make sure we get the cultural piece right, which means we need to honour what parental engagement looks like, and we need to honour work-life balance.
So we've talked about the rules and regulations, work-life balance, keeping women in the industry and also attracting women to the industry a bit. But I want to talk about quotas, because that's one of the big mechanisms for keeping women in the industry and also giving them something to aspire to further up. Are you for or against quotas? Because they really cut people like a knife. One way or the other.
They do, and I think I'm for quotas in the sense that I believe we need quota-based shortlists. So every shortlist that is drawn up should have diversity running right through it. I still believe we should choose the best person for the job. Now, alongside that, though, I think we all have a responsibility to do two things. One is to push our women forward, because I don't know about you, but I have a self-worth issue, and I don't always push myself forward. And it's a struggle, it's an effort to do it, but we have an obligation to do it ourselves, but also to push other people forward, which is sometimes just a tap on the shoulder to say, you should do this, you could do this, and you're the best candidate for the job, and you don't even see that. So come on, let me sponsor you into that, or just have a conversation.
So is that mentoring is big part of?
I think it's mentoring, but I think it's also about inspiring. I don't know about you, but there's someone in your life who has inspired you to do something. And it might have been a 30-second engagement. It might have been a teacher you had for a year. But that personal moment of inspiration is really special when you connect. You get that person and they get you, and you think everything is possible. And that's where you end up giving someone space to be amazing. And we all need that space to be amazing. And I believe that we can do that in small pockets. It doesn't have to be a formal mentoring scenario. It could just be that special moment.
Anecdotally, my first 2 bosses were women, excellent mentors, still mentors to this day, but they were tough.
Yeah.
People often say women bosses are tougher to other women. Sometimes we're in a situation where women, I know it's a cliche, but they don't help others further along up the line. How can we change that culture?
It is tricky. I've only come across 2 ever in my life, but they are really scary when you get them. And you know that Madeleine Albright quote, which is, "There's a special place in hell for women that don't help other women." Remember that, because there is a special place in hell for us. But I'm in a place where I believe that, you know, it shouldn't be this hard. And generosity is one of my core values, and I believe that, you know, just reaching out and giving someone a helping hand is really important. And dealing with, I mean, I tend to, being in a sales culture at Citrix, if I come up against a really scary woman, which I have twice, as I've said, I generally send someone else. Because you can't win. Chemistry just dictates you can't win. So, you know, I get it. But it's the same with anybody. It's not a gender issue. I think sometimes there is just chemistry that doesn't work. And that's okay. That's part of life.
Let's take another couple of questions. Any other questions from the floor? Don't be shy.
There's one there.
Oh. Sorry. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Susan from New Zealand. I often turn the conversation around. Rather than saying it's a female problem, it's actually a male problem.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because if you think about the economic empowerment of women and, you know, getting them back into the workforce, contributing to the economy, etc., it's important for men to understand that it's not okay to pay women less. It's not okay to prevent them from having promotions. But getting them to understand that if their wife, their partner, their daughter comes home and says, actually, I'm being treated differently because I am a woman, then that should be taken on board by a male, so they understand the important role of making sure that that's not fair and that's not good. So I think, you know, at the moment we always tag it as it's female choice or it's, you know, something along those lines. But in fact, if we can get males to understand that it's their problem too, it's their family's problem.
Yeah, I agree. And I think family is a really interesting place to start, isn't it? I was reading in the Financial Times this week that the gender pay gap starts with pocket money at home.
That's good.
So girls are paid, I think it's 16% less than boys in terms of pocket money. So who's programming who here? So we all have a little bit of accountability to make sure that we don't start that I don't deserve thing quite young. And also we need to make sure that the gender pay gap is something we absolutely won't tolerate. So, you know, we have to ask for it. We have to ask for pay rises. Or equality. And I think you're right, we do have to make sure that we've got men in the conversation at all times.
In your role as a boss, presumably you must have people knocking on your door and saying, knock, knock, I'd like to ask for a pay rise.
Yes.
We've done a lot of, we did a piece on it just the other day at CNN, following on from research that suggests yet again that women aren't as effective at asking for pay rises. Do you think that's the case, or do you think that they just ask for things in different ways? Or perhaps they negotiate money off something rather than asking for money on something else?
I think there's certainly a difference in the way that we request things, and I certainly frame it in a different way when I want something. But I will usually talk about my value to the business. And I'm actually, these days, I'm probably quite assertive. I will say, I think I'm worth this, even though inside I probably don't think that. But I will say those words because I think it's quite an important challenge, personal challenge for myself. And I think, you know, I don't know about you, but self-worth is my big thing. My fear of failure, self-worth thing is very ingrained in me as a child. And I don't think I'll ever get over that, by the way. I was definitely, you know, in the UK, we had this concept when I was a child, which was a long time ago because I'm 53. But we had this concept of school dinners, hot school dinners at school, and free school dinners for the poor kids. And so I was one of 2 poor children in the class. And the teacher would ask every Monday morning for school dinner money, and all the kids would troop up in a line with their dinner money in brown envelopes. And then she would say, and who's got free school dinners? And that would be me and my brother. And you had to put your hand up instead of walking up. But it was so humiliating that I felt that I never wanted that for myself in a future life, or for my children, or for anybody near me. You know, that is not going to happen. And it's a massive driver for me. And that's why I say that fear of failure, self-worth, you know, I've lived with that my whole life, and I don't think I'll get over that. But in a way, it's a miracle, because it drives me insanely towards perfection.
You had quite a tough upbringing, didn't you? Do you think that that sort of put you through the school of hard knocks to try and make sure that you were always going to keep working, you were always going to try and get towards the top?
I think so. I mean, I was born of a Chinese father and an English mother. My father, so my mother had a black eye every week. So father was a drinker, gambler, tax evader, and a bigamist, so quite a big spectrum. And I spent my childhood trying to be invisible. I mean, that's what, you know, I wasn't trying to do anything that would attract attention. So for me, shining a light on diversity and for, you know, for gender parity and for gender pay parity is really important, because I sort of came out, if you like, from invisible to visible. And that's a journey, and I know it will resonate with some people, but you know, it is really important to understand how we're programmed at a really young age to be the person that we become.
What was the strongest lesson that all of that taught you that really helps today?
I think the big lesson I learned was the difference I could make if I was striding versus taking baby steps towards average. And I thought, you know, and then my mother obviously left my father, and we acquired a stepfather who I didn't like, so that was the other part of the journey. And I remember age 16 when I had my little envelope of O-level results, and he said, "What's in there?" And this was my northern English stepfather who was a carpenter, so not a high achiever. And I said, "Well, it's my O-level results." And I got nine A's and a B or something like that, so fairly reasonable results. And he said the words, "What are you trying to do? Show me up." And I thought, oh, here we go. Age 16, I was quite wise, and I thought, here's my path breaking into two paths here. And I'm going to take the path which says, I'm going to show you how amazing I can be, rather than become like you and invisible. And I have spent my whole life showing him how amazing I can be. And I did think revenge would be a dish best served cold with him. But actually, he's mellowed so much, and now we're really great friends. It's almost frustrating that I can't get back at him. But, you know, again, the miracle. I've always looked for the miracle in everything I've done. And the miracle there was, look what I've done based on that interaction. And whilst it was not very pleasant at the time, it was tough, and it made me who I am.
But the glimmer of self-doubt, let's face it, is always there in the back of all of our minds. Perhaps it's a female trait. Do you remember at that moment the two sides fighting, the ambition, the self-doubt?
I think I looked at him and thought, I really don't want to be like you, so I think there was no option, actually. I think that's what it was. It was just, and anger, probably.
Right, which is always a great motivator.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of which, are there any more questions? Let's see with this. Don't be shy. Oh, there's one right at the back, thanks.
Hello, Hilary London from Merrill Corporation. You've talked about the importance of creating culture and having the right cultural environment. I'm really interested to know how you have gone about creating that culture.
Yeah. So part of it is, for example, you know, I've walked out of the office at 2:30 in the afternoon to pick up my own kids or to sort out something at home, made no apologies and not hidden it. So I think it's the small stuff that makes a difference. The ability to work wherever I am to suit whatever I'm trying to do is also very important. Again, very role model oriented. And also to mentor and bring through people in the organization who are emotionally aligned to the mission. Because I think that culturally makes a difference. I've got teams in my world who are mentors to other people or just spend time with, you know, underprivileged kids, for example. And, you know, I think those things count to make a difference. We also have changed our job descriptions so that programmer becomes problem solver, so that it's more female oriented. So we've done a lot of work with our talent teams to make sure that diversity is threaded right through, you know, what we say we want when we go fishing for talent. Because I think one of the areas we ignore a lot is job descriptions. We just say, oh yeah, use the last one. Bad idea. Because you get what you put out there, and you have to be really clear about what you're putting out there. The other thing we do in our business is we're big on storytelling. So the ability to create big word visions rather than three-letter acronyms. Because in our business, you can wall yourself up behind three-letter acronyms, and it's boring. And then you get boring people apply. And, you know, and you get lots of male boring people apply. Don't tweet that. So, you know, we just do things to sabotage our own success. So you've got to open out the culture to make it more appealing, more amazing, and more human. And that's what I mean. It's not the big stuff. It's the little stuff that we can all do in the cultural environment that we create.
And speaking of which, using an acronym, STEM,
oh, yes.
science, technology, engineering, maths, part of your industry's drive is to try and get people studying these kind of subjects at university. So, I mean, as we were saying before, sometimes the big question is, does sexism start at the home with pocket money? Does it also continue through choice of education at university, etc.? How can we get more women interested in that field? Because very often, I myself went to a big engineering and mathematics university. It was 85% men at the time when I went. It is intimidating.
Yeah. I think if our goal is to create businesses where we can become empowered through digital, then, you know, if you use the analogy, if we were going to create a football team to dominate the planet, we would be scouting for talent at age 4. We, in technology, we wait for them to rock up fully formed at age 22 or around that age, which is a ridiculous notion. So I think we need to go in much younger because they are seduced into our world much younger. And I think, you know, it doesn't have to be terribly technical, but having social media skills is not the same as having digital skills. So I think we need to make that distinction first. I think then we have to think about how we shine a light on little people being really creative in the applications world, for example, or the gaming world, or creative marketing.
Which has suffered from some horrendous examples of sexism in the gaming industry.
Entirely. But I was giving some awards out to 11-year-olds the other day, and they'd created some apps, and I was judging the apps. And I came across one little girl. I don't know about you, but 11-year-olds can be tiny or they can be big. I mean, there's a big disparity. There's a little girl called Emily, and she had, I said to Emily, tell me about your app. And she said, well, let me tell you why I created it first. I thought, oh, you're smart. And she said, we've got a big problem with teenage pregnancy. And I'm looking at her thinking, you're too small to say things like that. And she said, I've created this really horrendous game. And as you go through as you progress through the levels, it gets worse and worse. Your life becomes grimmer and grimmer. Because you've got this baby, you then have to feed it somehow. You have to look after it. And you go through each of the levels and life gets more and more awful. You know, you get Snapchatted by your friends to say, come out to play. And she has to Snapchat back saying, sorry, I've got the kid, can't come. Or, you know, you get paid less than minimum wage. So then the game opens an empty, creaking fridge door and there's nothing in it. So she has to spend her £16 on food for the kid and for her. And it gets worse. So I was looking at this app, and then I was telling a group of business people about it the next day. And one of the businessmen in the room put his hand up and said, I'd like to meet Emily, and I'd like to potentially buy her app, because I run a charity which is proactively seeking to reduce the level of teenage pregnancies. And the acknowledgement for the 11-year-old was so amazing. The connections we can make. Our networks are really important in terms of making those connections. She's so switched on to technology. She's so thrilled that someone thinks that what she built could be really useful. And that's where we can all make a difference, by shining a light on what little people do and acknowledging that and amplifying it. It's really cool, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I've never heard of that story, but I must say it's amazing. I'm going to look it up. Do we have any more questions from the room? Because we've only got a couple of minutes left, so there we go. Yes.
She hadn't named it, so it was in development, but I will find it for you if you link in with me. Yeah.
Very, very interesting story. Do you have any more questions? Anybody else? Final question before we let Jacqueline go, because I know she's got a plane to catch. When it comes to the online rhetoric, sometimes women, you know, in the cyberspace is quite a hostile environment sometimes for women. When you mentioned the issue, you referred to obliquely to the issues of Gamergate, the video game coding experts finding themselves inched out of that industry. Why do you think this tide of, in some cases, not all cases, vitriol has come from? Because it's come up really quickly, hasn't it?
It has come up quickly. I think, you know, our industry is both Beauty and the Beast, isn't it? So we can use it for amazingly positive things, but the viral nature of it means that it can be used for incredibly evil things as well, and very hurtful things. So it doesn't surprise me that it can be used for both, and it doesn't surprise me that it's come up. You know, when people are in business scenarios and see competition, I think there are ways of snuffing things out really fast and in quite a furiously aggressive way. So that doesn't surprise me, and I think we'll see more of it.
Do you think it's the anonymity, though,
that definitely,
that really...
It's easy, isn't it? I think when you are anonymous, and let's face it, the big hacker group, which is anonymous as well, you can do a lot of evil things under the cloak of darkness, and that's what the dark web and all of that stuff is about. So, yeah, I think anonymity does mean that there's more of that.
So I want to ask you, Jacqueline, what's your message to the women and men of the audience today, whom I apologise to for some of the comments that may or may not have been made. Obviously, what's your message to the people here today?
So if I had a message for myself 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago now, God help me, I would have said, be kinder to yourself. Because I think, you know, I spent a long time, probably still do, beating myself up about how my life is not quite as perfect as it should be. And actually, on balance, I've got a pretty amazing life. And I think that when things happen, the ability to hear that compliment that somebody pays you, and you know when you have the ability to dismiss it straight away. Ever done that? You know, just absorb it instead. And remember that generosity is also part of the other side of that coin, which is that one comment that you can give to somebody else, because that you might normally have just thought, but you actually decide to say it out loud and say, amazing contribution you made there, or what a difference that you made. You realize that it goes a long way to that person becoming, you know, advancing on their journey. So I would say generosity, both to yourself and to other people, would be my message to this audience.
Well, Jacqueline de Rojas, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.